All right, well, we're here with Dr. Jessica Turner, and we are thrilled to have her to talk to us a little bit today about her path and about how she got to where she is today. And then we've got a few informative questions for her, and we've got one little tricky question at the end that I'm going to throw at her. So we'll get started with her just introducing herself and what she's doing right now, and then telling us a little bit about the path that she took to get to this point in her career.
Fantastic. Well, sure. I'm Jessica Turner. I'm currently a professor in psychology at Georgia State with an affiliation in neuroscience and the Trend Center and the Center for Behavioral Neuroscience and all sorts of places. And I'm currently a cognitive neuroscientist, which means I study how the brain and the mind interact with each other. My background is torturous. um, when I was going off to college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew that math and English were my favorite high school topics. And I also really enjoyed drama, but I promised my mother I wouldn't be an actress for a living. So I wanted to do something with math and English, and the only thing I knew to do would be an engineer. So I wanted to go to engineering, but I didn't want to go to a large school. I had to go to a small school. So I wanted a small school that had an engineering program. And my mother and my father were very concerned that I make sure that I had other options in case I decided to change my major so that there would be a liberal arts option if I wanted to shift. So I needed a small liberal arts college with an engineering program, and there was one in the United States. So I went to Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania and dutifully enrolled as an engineer and spent a huge amount of time about 2 weeks before, or whenever it was we were supposed to sign up for classes my freshman year, working with my dad through the list of requirements. How do I get all the requirements in? Because being an engineer is extremely demanding in terms of the number of classes that you take. And there were a number of requirements about this and that you had to have in your first year and your second year, et cetera. So I went off and we worked this all out, how to be an engineer, how to get everything done. And I went off to become an engineer. And spring of my freshman year, I said, this is not working. I took the first engineering class and said, I am terrified that I'm going to fail. And I am simultaneously bored out of my mind. And this is not a good combination. So I knew I had to switch. I said, I could see what everybody else was going to be doing as they were moving forward in their engineering program. And I said, this is clearly not it. I was doing fine. I was getting decent grades and I did okay in physics and math and everything else that I needed, and chemistry and whatever. But I was just like this, I can't do this. This is not for me. So I had to figure out what I wanted to major in. And I wanted to keep the math. I wanted to keep the math, but I didn't want to be a math major because I'm like, I just don't know what you do with a math degree. But my sophomore, the spring of my freshman year, because I was an engineer, I was able to do all sorts of crazy things with my requirements. And I basically saw that there was an abnormal psych class. And I had psych in high school. I'd had a high school psychology class. And so I weaseled my way into an upper level abnormal psych class, which I wasn't supposed to be able to take because I didn't have the prerequisites. But I went and talked to the professor and she was like, fine, whatever, come on in. And so I was taking an abnormal psych class, which is absolutely fascinating. And I was reading all the books and I was doing all the extra reading and I was having a wonderful time. And I said, this is probably a good sign, that this is a topic I would be interested in. So I decided to switch to a double major in math and psychology. And so I basically, between freshman and sophomore year, I completely reworked my schedule so I could figure out how to double major in math and psychology. And the engineering professors were all very upset with me because they're like, no, you can't leave. You're actually a woman who's doing well in the engineering program. These are the kinds of things that they want to see. And I was just like, they said, don't worry about it. You can do it. And I'm like, I know I can do it, but I don't want to do it. So I went off and did a double major in math and psychology and also picked up a lot of computer science along the way. I did 3 or 4 classes in computer science because I thought I wanted to study artificial intelligence. I'm like, that's something you can do with math and psychology. So you can study artificial intelligence. And so then as I was getting closer, I basically figured out in junior year that if I was going to go to grad school, I had to start doing research. And so I weaseled my way into an adult perception lab. And they said, oh, you can program. here, program this stuff for us. And so I was working away on trying to learn C and work with Macintosh and get Macintoshes to actually put up video displays and whatnot. And it was amusing, let's just say, but incredibly informative. But at the same time, as I was getting into my senior year, basically I did my summer doing research in this lab and programming, and worked out an honors thesis so I could actually use the program to collect my own data, and I could look at what did people see were connected. I basically had bouncing balls all over the screen, and I wanted to see when did people think they were connected and when did they not think they were connected. I was very interested in sort of the interpretation side of perception. So I knew what the balls were doing, but what would people see them as doing was really the question that came out that I was working with. So my senior year, fall of my senior year, I'm madly applying to graduate schools, and I wrote an NSF graduate research fellowship proposal and submitted that in October. But I was still applying for jobs because I'm like, maybe I won't get into grad school, So I was applying to like consulting firms and insurance companies, and Prudential in New Jersey. Prudential like snapped me up and flew me out to Newark and, put me up in a hotel that had marble sinks. I was so impressed. I'd never seen a marble sink in a hotel before. They picked us up in a limousine and took us to the job interview. And they were basically grabbing high performing undergrads and trying to put them into like management, tracks and high performance management. And they made me a job offer that blew my mind. And my mom was like, "Oh my God, you're set for life." And I was like, "Yeah, no." Because I went on all these job interviews and I met people who had been at my college. And they weren't like me. They weren't people I had hung out with. They weren't people who majored in the same stuff that I majored in. And I was like, clearly these are not my people. And I didn't want to wear nylons to work. So I really threw myself into applying to graduate school. And spring of my senior year, I lost my voice, I think 3 times because I had really bad colds and allergies. I finally developed allergies to like everything that was blooming on campus. And we did not have room phones. And of course we didn't have cell phones, And so we had a hall phone. And so all of these grad schools kept calling, trying to reach me. And I would have laryngitis. My roommate, I think, did a number of my interviews for me, basically saying, "She can't come to the phone right now." But they let me in anyway. And so I went off to graduate school in math. Basically, I looked for mathematical psychology programs. And they were very excited to get somebody who had a math and a psych background. And I thought I wanted to build robots that could see. And I wanted to solve how we actually see things and how we do visual perception. And I was going to build a robot that could solve, how it is that we actually see things. Because, of course, in 1990, we didn't have those things yet. And I very quickly figured out that it was way more complicated than we thought. And so I basically studied visual perception and mathematical models of visual perception and had a great time in graduate school, and then went off and did a postdoc in neuroscience. And I didn't figure out what I wanted to be until I was 30. And I got in my postdoc in neuroscience, figured out how to do functional MRI because I realized that animal neuroscience was not for me, so I took a few more turns even than you did, Mike, and ended up just falling in love with fMRI because I could run a machine and see inside somebody's head, and I could measure the signals in their brain when they're imagining something or seeing something, and I didn't have to cut them open, and I didn't have to poke them with needles or anything, and it was just astounding. And so that's how I got into sort of cognitive neuroscience from that side of view. But I basically didn't want to be a professor. I mean, I went to graduate school and I was sort of freaking out because I'm like, I don't really want to be a professor. And I just kept going because it's like, I enjoy doing this. I was sitting in my lab, like my second year, staring at the whiteboard in my lab and trying to, work out equations of this, that, or the other thing. And I said, these people are paying me to think. I'm just sitting here being paid to think. They don't care. I mean, they kind of care what I'm doing, but literally they're paying me to think, meanwhile, I've got friends and family who are working in banks or working in retail or whatever. And like, I'm being paid to think. This is awesome. And then I went off and did a postdoc, and I was like, I could apply for tenure track positions, but my publication history isn't that strong. And I seem to be doing pretty well at getting like postdoc grants and things like that. And one of my advisors said, you don't have to be a professor. You can live on research money.
Mhm.
And it's possible to do that. And I was like, it's what? It's what now? And that's what I proceeded to do until I came to GSU 6 or 7 years ago, was just live on soft money, writing grants and collaborating with people who wrote grants and sort of doing what I want to do because it's exciting. That's how I got here.
Yeah, so I have more questions for you, but I
take all the time? I probably did.
No, you're definitely good, but it's just funny. A couple of things you said, it's really interesting too, because like I love that you talked about sort of sneaking your way into a class that you didn't have the prereqs for, and I think probably all of us when we were undergrads thought that was like a major decision for the professor, and now of course we all know that we see those emails and we're like, sure, whatever, like we don't care, just come in. If you're writing to me because you want to be in here, you can come in here.
That's right. Come on in. Yeah.
And so, you have a really interesting sort of I guess maybe more non-traditional path too, and that you really did use your PhD to sort of focus on your research for a long time, and then sort of cycle back into becoming probably more of what you thought a professor was from the professors you had as an undergrad and then as a grad student, and now we're doing that.
Yeah.
So my first question is, through that whole process, what would you say was sort of the biggest hurdle that you had to overcome, that sort of moment or that activity that, was really a big challenge for you, that once you got past that, you were more solidified in knowing that this is who you were going to be?
I'm not sure I know who I want to be, so I'm going to steer away from that side of thing. But something that sort of kept me going, especially if I focus on graduate school, I think it was appreciating the ups and downs. Because, for example, we didn't have to do a master's thesis in my program, but we did have to do a second year presentation. We had to do formal second year 15-minute talk in front of the department. We all freaked out about it and thought it was terrifying. And looking back on it now, I'm sort of like, whatever. But the idea was you would do your second year project on something that would then become your dissertation, so that you could sort of work your way into it. And there were a lot of people who didn't do that, who did their second year talk and then went on. And I remember asking one of my friends, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you use your second year talk to do your dissertation on? Because this was my first year, and I thought, gosh, you put so much work into this second year talk. Why don't you just go on? And he was like, I never want to see it again. I'm so tired of it. I never want to see it again. And of course, I felt exactly the same way. By the end of my second year, I'm like, I do not want to discuss this anymore. I'm going to do something completely different for my dissertation, which I did. But sort of that understanding that there is an ebb and flow, that you're not always in love with what you're doing, and that keeping your eyes open and your options open to say, what else can I do? What is it that I love about this? And what is it that's really driving me nuts? And so that you have your own meta awareness, if you will, of where you are and what really motivates you. And similarly, when we get to the dissertation, it's when you're ready to throw it on the floor and just stomp it into the ground because you just never want to see it again. You're done. Schedule the defense. And just knowing that we all do that and we all feel burned out at points. The commonality of it. It's the same thing with imposter syndrome. When I finally heard about that at some point, I was like, oh yeah, I have felt that way. It's like, okay, we all feel that. And so that immediately gives you a sense of bonding with people around you, that you're not alone in this.
So a related question is what was an event or an accomplishment or something that happened to you in the graduate school days, or maybe early in your career post PhD, that really gave you confidence and made you feel like, okay, that's special, and I'm doing well, I'm doing okay, I'm doing good?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, it really was sort of finding out that everybody goes through the same phases. Also, there was something that really chuffed me and in a good sense, when I was applying for a postdoc, or I was starting to think about postdocs. And again, I was, coming to the end of my dissertation, and I probably still had a year to go, but I knew what I was doing. I could sort of see the end coming. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. I have no idea what my next step is. How do I get a postdoc, right? And I got an email from somebody, from the fellow who eventually became my postdoc advisor, who said, I work on, structure from motion, which is what I was doing my dissertation on, in animals. And your undergraduate thesis came across my desk. I was like, what? And it turned out one of the people on my undergraduate thesis committee was now working at that same university and had been talking to him and said, oh, I had this, this undergrad who was doing something very similar to what you were doing when she was in as an undergrad. And I'll bet she's in graduate school. Let's track her down and see where she is. I got my dissertation because he basically looked at my undergrad thesis, which I thought was I was very embarrassed by it after a few years being in graduate school. But he could see the potential and say, if you were doing that as an undergrad, let's see where you're at now. And I worked with him for 2 years. Turned out I can't do neuroscience, per se. He was doing the invasive animal research stuff. But nonetheless, it was fantastic to work with him, and I was like, oh, wow, somebody actually remembered me, from 6 years ago and thought what I was doing was good. And that was really a bolstering, that says, okay, weird things happen occasionally where just, connections are made and you just don't know what's going to play out.
Yeah. And just have to be sort of ready for those when they come, right?
Exactly. I always say I've never gotten a job I applied for. I only get the jobs that come to me. If I find a job and apply for it, they're never interested in me. But if somebody comes to me and goes, I think you might be a good fit here, that's what works out.
So you talked a little bit about some of the people that you've worked with, but along the way, is there a person or maybe a couple of people that you'd highlight as really sort of taking a mentoring role or a supportive role in a way that helped get you through those ebbs and flows that you talked about in graduate school and early in your career?
Yeah, I'll tell you. Actually a little bit later in my career. I've enjoyed working with almost everybody. I think I've had maybe one bad working situation. Everybody who I've worked with has been wonderful. And everybody's had their own strengths and weaknesses. Like my undergraduate mentor was marvelous. You couldn't get him to say a negative word about anybody, but he was also a hermit and had no sense of networking whatsoever, and getting, so we were very much on our own to make connections and going to conferences and things. He would take us to conferences, but he would never model interactions. He would never introduce us to anybody other than the same two people that, he worked with. And so I never really got into that community in a sense, whereas my postdoc advisor was frenetic about networking because he was one of these people who was absolutely terrified. So he could have been a hermit like my graduate advisor, but he basically said, I don't want to be like that. I am going to force myself to be courageous. And he just was. And because I asked him at one point, I said, everybody, how do you do that? And he said, I just go up to them and introduce myself and talk to them. And everybody's usually very happy to talk about their research. And the next thing you know, you've made friends all over the place. And I was just like, that works, but it did. And so I sort of learned that you can change, from that experience. But also I did have one bad working relationship where I don't know what was wrong with these people or what was wrong with me or how we just didn't fit in, but they didn't. I left one position feeling like everything was a little bit overwhelming and like I would never be able to make it as a researcher, and I was never going to be at a point where I was really publishing, and things were always just going to be overwhelming. And I started working at UC Irvine with Stephen Potkin, and he was a dynamo of a researcher. And there was one point very early on where we were driving to San Diego for a conference, right? And I'd been working with him for maybe a month. And we drove to San Diego and we were at this conference all day and we were driving back. And he was telling me on the way back all about the issues with the IRB and the challenges and all this stuff. And because he was trying to get this clinical trial running, And I was just like, and I'm just getting this sinking feeling like, oh my God, I've been here before. This is not going to be good. And I said, so are you going to give up? Or are you going to let it go? And he was like, let it go. Let it go. course you don't let it go. and he basically was very like, no, you don't just give up. You just keep going. Of course you just keep going. And he basically modeled the perseverance that is needed to get grants together, to get papers out, to work through all of the issues in a way that I had not seen in previous situations. And so, that I've always found his example, because he just never stopped. And it was a fantastic example for me to say, okay, this is how it's done, in terms of moving forward.
Okay, so we have one more question for you. This is the softball question. We are collecting in all of these interviews that one word or one phrase or one concept that haunted and tortured you through lab meetings and through your coursework, where you lowered your head and hoped that there would be no eye contact made with you because you had not the faintest idea what that meant, or what everybody else around you seemed to know that you didn't know. So what would you put on our list of words and phrases?
Okay, so I came into a lab when we were doing visual perception, right? We're studying visual perception. We were programming up computers to present things and look at how people see depth, particularly how do people interpret motion as indicating, depth, right? And I knew nothing about projections, perspective, nothing at all. And we were working with it was my advisor and two other professors. One of them was a mathematician, and one of them was sort of computational psychologist. And we always joke that my advisor was the colonel, or my advisor was sort of the colonel, the computational psychologist was the front end, and the mathematician was the guy who basically made it all happen. But because the mathematician would come up with these unbelievably complicated models of how we mathematically might be extracting depth from motion cues, and the computational guy would sell it so that you could get a paper or a grant, and my advisor would make sure the data actually got collected and everything. And so the grad students in the lab were programming up all of these really crazy 4-dimensional transformations and things like that. And so they were talking about perspective and orthogonal projections and perspective projections and affine transformations. And I sort of understood orthogonal perspective and perspective, if you will, the kind of stuff from art class. But they kept talking about these affine transformations, and they programmed up this stuff that I'm like, that looks like a triangle turning itself inside out. I don't know what you guys are seeing here. And they explained it to me when I visited. They explained, and they would explain it every lab meeting. I'm just like, yeah, I'll be really happy when this project's over. I had no idea what they were talking about. 6 months. I think it was the full first year. I was sort of like, I got no idea what's going on here. Eventually you pick up enough, but I don't think I understood affine transformations until I was actually trying to munge one brain onto another using neuroimaging. I'm like, oh, affine transformation. I get it now. Yeah, that's it. We all have these problems.
Exactly. Well, we'll add that one to the list.
There you go.
So thank you very much for sharing all of that. Yours is obviously a really interesting path, and hopefully anybody who's watching this among our hundreds of thousands of YouTube viewers or wherever this is being used will take all of your hard-earned knowledge and use that to aid themselves in either getting into or getting through grad school. So thank you very much.
Heart. You never know what's going to come down the path at you next.
Thank you very much.